After much delay due to Chinese holidays, Cyrene's V3 beta changes are finally out. So let's just dive straight in and talk about what's changed for her. First things first, if you aren't familiar with how Cyrene's kit works, check out my first impressions video of her for a quick rundown on her abilities. Otherwise, let's see if Cyrene was buffed or nerfed. We have to start with the most important thing, the most pressing issue everyone has brought up for Cyrene, her ramp up time. Cyrene's ultimate takes a long time to charge, oftentimes taking the entire first cycle, and even then, she sometimes only gets it thanks to Hyacine. If you don't have Hyacine, it gets even more rough. Going into her third round of beta changes, which are oftentimes the biggest changes of the whole beta, I was expecting a complete revamp to how her ultimate stacking worked. Some way to make the ramp up time easier or more comfortable. And that is the one thing they didn't touch. Yep, color me surprised. Cyrene's ramp up time is still the exact same. There were no changes to how quickly she can stack her ultimate, and there were no changes to the amount of stacks she initially starts the battle with. She still needs 24 stacks for her first ultimate. Obviously, this is a bit of a bummer. One of my major issues with Cyrene wasn't necessarily with her strength, but more on the fact that she just felt unfun to play for the first cycle because she needs to spam her skill, even though spamming her skill has no real effect, just to get stacks for her ultimate. And her buffs are underwhelming without her ultimate. And she takes the entire first cycle before she starts feeling like she's pulling her weight. I compared it once to funneling Xiangling in Genshin Impact, for those of you who understand that reference, and unfortunately, this has not changed. Cyrene still feels every bit as sluggish and slow to play. Of course, to compensate, they did buff her elsewhere. Let's start with her general kit first, before we go through each specific Chrysos Heir. The first simple change is that Cyrene's team-wide true damage buff went from 20% to 24%. Not the biggest buff in the world, but a numbers buff is still a numbers buff, and this helps her during her downtime when her ultimate isn't active, so we definitely take that as a win. Another simple change is that Cyrene now cleanses herself of all debuffs when her initial ultimate reaches 24 stacks and is able to be activated. So this helps you avoid scenarios where you spend the entire first cycle painfully gathering stacks for her, but then not even being able to activate her ultimate once you get it because she gets frozen by Cocolia or something like that. Now, she'll instantly cleanse herself so she can use her ultimate no matter what once it's available. Just a slight quality of life upgrade, which is nice. The last changes outside of her Chrysos Heir buffs is actually a few changes to Cyrene's personal damage. First off, the damage of Cyrene's attacking Memesprite skill was buffed a little bit, from 50% of her HP to 60% of her HP. Secondly, her E1 was moved to her base kit. As a reminder, her E1 used to give her stacks of story every time she casts her ultimate, whether it be the buffing ability or the attacking ability from her ultimate. Once she got 3 stacks of story, or basically once she'd used her ultimate 3 times in any form, she would automatically cast her offensive Memesprite skill for free, with increased damage. This has now been moved to her base kit, but without the increased damage. Still, it's a free attack from her Memesprite skill without actually needing to spend 12 stacks just to attack, since you get it for free every 3 casts of her ultimate, even if you're spamming her buff. This helps her personal damage a little bit, but what it mainly does is it allows her to proc her light cone even in teams where she wants to spam her buffing skill constantly, like for Anax and Mighty, since her signature light cone requires her to use both her buffing and her attacking Memesprite skill. And now she gets her attacking Memesprite skill for free, even while buffing. So really, this change is mainly just to make her signature light cone actually usable on her in some teams, whereas before it was literally impossible to use its full effect without sacrificing her buffs. Speaking of her signature light cone, we might as well mention it here since we're already on the topic. It basically got nerfed. Instead of doubling the value of her vulnerability debuff and crit damage buff, they now only get increased by around 60% of their original value. So whereas before it was 20% vulnerability and 32% crit damage when fully stacked, it would now be 16% vulnerability and around 25% crit damage. The trade-off for this, of course, is that it's now easier to get this full effect, as we mentioned earlier, since she now gets a free attack from her Memesprite skill, even while spamming her buff. A decent trade-off, I would say. Okay, now we can finally get into what changed for each of the Chrysos Heirs. So let's just go down the list in release order, starting with Remembrance Trailblazer. The only thing that changed for Cyrene's buff for RMC is that she now gives even more crit rate, from granting RMC 60% of Cyrene's crit rate to now giving 72% of Cyrene's crit rate, meaning you really don't need to worry about building crit rate for RMC's new enhanced basic attack. On the flip side, we can talk about the direct changes they made to RMC themselves, not even within Cyrene's kit. First off, it looks like they changed RMC's ultimate cost, but this is fake. Don't worry about it. RMC's ultimate has always cost 160 on live servers, so I don't know why they're showing it changing to 160 when that's already its current cost. Anyway, the actual nerf was to RMC's new enhanced basic attack, where the scaling was cut pretty hard. Before you lament about how this is a nerf to DPS RMC, it actually isn't, because DPS RMC is always paired with Cyrene anyway, and Cyrene's own personal damage was buffed in both scaling and frequency, so RMC's own damage was basically nerfed to compensate for the fact that Cyrene will be doing a bit more damage in their teams now. Cyrene's crit rate buff was also buffed for RMC to compensate, so all in all, the damage of a DPS RMC team shouldn't actually be lower. The damage contribution of the team has just shifted a bit, and if I'm being perfectly honest, the character contributing the most damage in an RMC and Cyrene team still isn't going to be either of them. It's still going to be Tribby. Speaking of Tribby, oh wait, we should cover Aglaya first. Yeah, Aglaya got no changes. Okay, now speaking of Tribby, yeah, Tribby also got no changes. Mighty! Mighty got some very funny and minor changes. First of all, now when she uses her buff on Mighty, it removes all crowd control debuffs on him, even though he's already immune to crowd control debuffs in his Vendetta state. So it is very funny that they added a detail to her buff that doesn't do anything for him. Okay, technically it cleanses him when he's not in Vendetta, but Mighty should always be in Vendetta. So this is pretty useless for all the same reasons her action advance on him is useless, since they only happen when he's outside of his Vendetta state, which is never. Okay, technically, again, when Sirene is E2, she can activate her ultimate on Mighty super fast before he even reaches Vendetta state. But even in those scenarios, you'd probably want to wait for Mighty to enter Vendetta on his own so she can focus on giving him extra God Slayers. Anyway, useless changes aside, they also buffed the crit damage buff that Sirene gives Mighty from 60% to 80%. Keep in mind that this crit damage buff still only applies to the instant God Slayer that she gives him, but it is technically a very small damage buff. Just something to try and convince you that they haven't totally forgotten about Mighty. Casters got no change to her buff, but as we'll see later, Casters teams as a whole did see a buff, just in other ways. Anax's is quite interesting. First of all, the most obvious thing about Anax's buff is that the attack buff is now for every erudition unit on the team, so this buff is actually geared more towards Herta rather than Anaxa. It's nice that Cyrene is now more usable in a Herta team so long as you have Anaxa, but given that her competition is Tribby, who synergizes so well with Herta, it's mostly to help Cyrene be a side grade option. Now, the real change is to how the mechanic behind Anax's action advance works. You see, prior to these changes, the wording stated that it would advance Anax's next action. This means you could use Cyrene's buff on Anaxa on his turn, getting all of the buffs and the additional bounces from his skill, and then after his turn, he would immediately action advance to his second turn, so it would basically look like he got 2 turns in a row, and both of these turns would be buffed, which was huge. However, they have now changed the wording. It no longer says it action advances Anaxa's next action, meaning it's very likely that you can no longer cheat out 2 fully buffed turns for Anaxa from Cyrene. This is very sad if it has indeed been removed, essentially cutting the amount of buffed turns Anaxa gets from Cyrene in half. And to compensate, they've tried to push her more towards buffing Anaxa's Herta teams, which is definitely not the direction I would have taken with Cyrene and Anaxa, but it is what it is. Overall, it's a nerf to Anaxa. The damage buffs she gives him are still very good, he just isn't able to abuse it in the same way anymore. Neither of the 3.3 characters changed, so Hyacinth and Cypher's buffs remain untouched. And now we get to the big one, the big man himself, Faon. There's quite a bit to talk about here. First off, Cyrene now instantly gives Faon 6 core flame stacks. That's nuts, right? Well, not really. Her ultimate already fills Faon's ultimate completely, so it's not like these core flame stacks are helping him stack his ultimate, since, well, she already gives him 12 core flame stacks. In fact, it would be more accurate to say her ultimate now gives him 18 core flame stacks instead of 12, which is obviously just super unnecessary. Well, Hoyo has tried to make it seem necessary by adding a crit damage buff for every stack of core flame above 12 that Faon had. It's 12% crit damage per excess core flame stack, stacking up to 72% crit damage, or stacking up to 6 excess core flame stacks. This is the sort of buff I really wanted to see for Faon, because I hated how she made his core flame stack mechanic completely pointless, since she just fills his ultimate for him anyway. Attaching a buff mechanic based on the amount of core flames he had is a super good way to help his core flame stacking still feel relevant, right? No. Unfortunately, the way they've implemented it still makes his core flame stacking mechanic pointless. First off, an E0 Faon can only hold up to 15 core flame stacks, so he can't even max out the 6 stacks of the crit damage buff since he can only hold 3 excess core flame stacks anyway. Maybe there's a way Cyrene counts excess core flame stacks even though it doesn't show up on his ultimate, but if not, then the full buff is locked to E6 Faon only, since it gets rid of the cap on his core flame stacks, which is really weird if this is the case. But that's not even my main issue with this mechanic. My main issue with it is the fact that it still doesn't change the fact that Cyrene negates Faon's core flame stacking mechanic. Since Cyrene gives him his ultimate and then also gives him the 6 excess core flame stacks he need, you still don't care about core flame stacks from his teammates or from Faon's skill, since Cyrene alone fulfills all the conditions. Her buff could literally just remove the crit damage buff that scales on his core flame stacks and instead just give him the crit damage buff for free, and nothing would change, because the fact that it's tied to his core flame stacks actually doesn't matter, since Cyrene gives it for free anyway. The core flame stack part is just there for flavor text. Faon is still on basic attack duty, since his skill does literally nothing in Cyrene teams, since core flame stacks are still pointless. Sorry, I'm just a little annoyed. However, please don't think this means that this beta update was bad for Faon, because they actually did buff Cyrene's synergy with him. First of all, even though I'm crashing out over how they implemented the excess core flame thing, the fact that Cyrene's ultimate now gives Faon 6 core flames means you technically no longer need to reset the fight if Faon ends up dying in his ultimate. Since dying is the only way for Faon to exit his ultimate with Cyrene, you would previously just reset the entire fight if he dies, because Cyrene has no way to get him into a second ultimate. Now, she actually can generate core flames for him, and since she begins the fight with 2 uses uses of her ultimate, you can technically save the second use of her ultimate in case Faon dies in his ultimate and you need Cyrene to give him core flame stacks for his second ultimate. I don't recommend doing this, but it's technically something you can do now, which I suppose is comfortable for people who will find themselves dying. At least it's a bit of added flexibility in some scenarios. To help you paint the picture, it looks like this. Cyrene's first ultimate instantly activates Faon's ultimate and fills his ultimate to the full 12 core flame stacks, and also gives 6 extra stacks, but obviously Faon can only hold up to 15. So since Faon was overcapping by 3, if he exits his ultimate by dying, he has those 3 excess core flames and also gets another 3 core flames because his passive gives him 3 core flames upon exiting ultimate. That's an instant 6 core flames. If you held Cyrene's second ultimate from the first rotation, meaning you chose not to use it on Cyrene and you just held onto it, then you can use it to give Faon the remaining 6 core flames he needs, thus instantly activating his ultimate right after exiting it. Again, this is only relevant if your Faon dies during his ultimate and ends up needing a second one, and choosing to just hold onto Cirene's ultimate stacks is sort of questionable, but it's nice to have the option to do it now in fights where you can plan around this sort of rotation. Now, one of the changes I really like is that Cyrene now gives Faon 4 stacks of Scourge when he uses his ultimate's finishing move. Scourge is the resource he uses for his meteors, for those who don't know. In Faon's current teams, whenever Faon enters his ultimate, he would gain 4 stacks of Scourge via his talent, which is the required amount to get an instant meteor. Therefore, there actually was some benefit to exiting his ultimate and then re-entering it, since re-entering it would give you an instant meteor. Cyrene did not have this before, meaning not being able to exit Faon's ultimate actually robbed you of that free meteor that he usually gets when he's able to exit and then re-enter his ultimate. Now, Cyrene has been changed so that when Faon uses his ultimate exiting move, even though he doesn't actually exit it, he acts as if he did and still gains the 4 stacks of Scourge for a free meteor when he, quote, re-enters. This is a big quality of life change, and I'm actually really excited about this. I can't wait to test it out and see how much smoother her permanent ult uptime now feels for Faon. To compensate for these things, the additional fire damage she gave Faon has been nerfed, going from a 150% multiplier down to a 50% multiplier, which is a fairly hefty nerf, but I think the trade-off is worth it. And the crit rate buff Cyrene gives is still there and the same, and her ramp up time hasn't changed, so Faon does still have similar issues with Cyrene as before in that department, meaning you'll still require some very cringe rotations to cycle through Cyrene's ultimate in a timely fashion with Faon that heavily relies on using RMC, but at least she did get some positive changes with him overall. Cyrene and Heislin's buffs didn't change at all, so we can skip right on to the final 2 Chrysos Heirs. Evernight's buff is interesting. The damage percent that Cyrene gives to Evernight has been nerfed by 30%, but to compensate, Evernight's team-wide crit damage now gets buffed by an additional 12% of Evernight's crit damage. If Evernight has upwards of 200 crit damage, this means Cyrene is now giving an extra 24% crit damage buff, possibly scaling higher. Obviously, this change is geared towards Casarus teams, where the increased crit damage buff is definitely a fair trade-off, since it's now buffing Casarus more instead of Evernight. How funny is it that Cyrene's changes for Anax and Evernight were actually more geared towards buffing Herta and Casarus? Anyway, these are very welcome changes for Cyrene's place in the Remembrance teams, since she's been struggling to compete with Tribby for her slot on their teams. And that still isn't going to change in full AoE scenarios, but Cyrene's gimmick with Casarus has always been mainly for single target scenarios, and now she's going to be slightly better in that niche. As for main DPS Evernight, it shouldn't change too much. The damage percent isn't a huge loss, and the Memoria stacks have remained the same. Underwhelming, but still enough for her to be good with Evernight. And lastly, for Danheng Romancer Terai, they shifted around some of the wording of his buff, but in terms of numbers and mechanics, nothing actually changed. To briefly touch on Idolon changes, her E1 obviously changed now that her old E1 is in her base kit. Her new E1 increases the damage of her attacking Memsprite skill just like her old E1 did, but now it also adds 6 recollection stacks when she activates her free attacking Memsprite skill. Do note that this doesn't affect her ramp up time, since her free attack only happens every time you've used 3 Cyrene ultimates. So this just helps her ramp up faster later in the fight, which can be really nice for characters like Mighty and Anaxa. Her E2 remains the same, solving all of her ramp up time issues. It's clear what Hoyo is trying to do, and I really hope future betas at least make this her E1. Her E4 was always a ramping increase to her personal damage, and now that damage increase is going to ramp up faster, but it also has a cap now, so that's something. And lastly, her E6 just got changed from Res Pen to Defense Tread, in addition to keeping all of its other effects, such as being a pseudo Robin ult and a pseudo Dance Dance Dance. So there you have it. Those are all of Cyrene's changes for the Chrysos Heirs, as well as all of her general changes summarized. There's always so much to cover with Cyrene because of how many different and specific buffs are in her kit, but overall, I would say she was mostly buffed across the board, with a few caveats. Anax's hypercarry performance is getting nerfed, so that's unfortunate, and her ramp up time is still going to feel abysmal to play, especially for those who don't own Hyacinth. Outside of that, she's buffing Casarus more so long as you have Evernight on the team, and she can also buff Herta now if you use Anaxa on the team. And she got some interesting changes to Faon, mostly positive, though it's not everything I would have liked to see. I can't complain about small victories, especially when the changes help fix some of the inherent clunkiness of the permanent ultimate mechanic. How do you feel about these changes? Glad to see some buffs across the board? Saddened by her nerfed synergy with Hypercurie and Naxa? Excited for the Faon changes? Or are you still just too disappointed by the fact that her ramp-up time hasn't been changed, thus making her continue to feel backloaded and annoying to play? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll also try to answer any questions you may have about her V3 beta changes. Like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. There will definitely be plenty more Sirene content on the way, not just covering her future beta changes, but also my overall thoughts on her as she gets closer to releasing. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss out on any of that. Her V4 is still coming within the next few days, so there's still time for them to change her future. Please join me in hoping and coping for more positive changes to come. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time!